You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
The initial disengagement talks between India and China ended in bloody clashes and the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers. The second attempt led to new PLA encroachments, and now a third try is showing the first signs of reduction of the biggest standoff between the countries since 1962 along the LAC. On 6 July, troops of both the armies stepped back 1 to 2 kilometers from where they had clashed on 15 June at the Galwan Valley. All tents have also been packed up and troops and materials have been taken back in vehicles. But the MEA and the Chinese Foreign Ministry statement seem to have conflicting tones. In an official statement, the MEA said that both sides have agreed to ensure complete disengagement and de-escalation from the India-China border areas for full restoration of peace and tranquillity. While the Chinese Foreign Ministry also put out a similar statement, it did so without any mention of de-escalation. Rather, it asserted its sovereignty over the Galwan Valley. So, is the tense military standoff along the Himalayan border finally diffusing? And what do we make of New Delhi and Beijing's contrasting statements? You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you. And I'm your host, Shorburi. The 1 kilometer withdrawal at Ladakh's Galwan Valley came after special representatives of India and China held a telephonic conversation on the recent developments at the LAC on 5th July, and the two sides decided to complete the disengagement process expeditiously. According to the MEA, the National Security Advisor of India, Ajit Doval, and the State Councillor and Minister of Foreign Affairs of China had a quote-unquote frank and in-depth exchange of views on the recent developments and agreed to take quote-unquote guidance from the consensus of leaders and not allow differences to become disputes. And so the first steps of disengagement were taken. The Chinese military pulled back, they dismantled their tents and structures in two other contested zones, Hot Springs and Gogra. Indian Army also stepped back by roughly 1.5 kilometers. A buffer zone of around 3 to 4 kilometers was also agreed upon at the border. But while China is moving away from the points that it had intruded on, some reports said that for the Indian troops it means that some of its traditional patrolling points, such as points 14, 15 and 17, would be off limits now. A report on the Indian Express also quoted an officer saying that at the Galwan Valley, the buffer zone is expected to lie on the Indian side of the LAC, which will keep the Indian soldiers to the west of the Shyok River, while the Chinese soldiers will be to the east of the LAC. Although a report on India Today also suggested that the Indian Army will resume patrolling up to Galwan's Patrol Point 14, which was the site of the bloody clash, once all disengagement phases are completed. So then, did India lose ground in any manner at the LAC? Manoj Keval Ramani, a fellow of China Studies at the Takshashila Institution, says it's too early to surmise that, but the focus should be on losing out on conflict.
Look, some of these reports that we are getting of this disengagement, it's all really murky at the moment. We're getting some reports which inform us that troops on both sides are going to step back 1.5 kilometers or 2 kilometers, and there's going to be a buffer zone. I don't think we should be quick to judgment on any of this. These are ongoing processes. These are delicate and sensitive issues, and I don't think it's right for any one of us to be extremely quick to judgment saying India has lost out or China has lost out or any of that. I think these are complex processes. We know that this disengagement process has to happen at multiple levels in different locations. And I think we should wait to see how this plays out before we start talking about losing and gaining. What both sides lose out on the most is conflict. And avoiding that without sort of giving up on your fundamental territorial claims is important. But I think we should wait to see how this plays out rather than passing judgment at the moment saying that India has lost out or China has lost out and how this buffer zone policy is going to impact the future. I think we should just hang on for some time. Anyway, reports on the ground have been extremely difficult to come by. And I think it's important to just wait and see how this develops rather than jumping to conclusions.
So that's the situation on ground. But coming back to the press releases from both the governments, a closer look at them shows very contradictory tones. The MEA statement, while making no mention of Galwan Valley, said that the countries, and I'm quoting the statement, quote, agreed that it was necessary to ensure at the earliest the complete disengagement of the troops along the LAC and de-escalation from India-China border areas for full restoration of peace and tranquility, end quote. And the statement also said, quote, they further agreed that both sides should complete the ongoing disengagement process along the LAC expeditiously, end quote. But the Chinese press release bears a very different sentiment. While it doesn't even mention the word de-escalation, it says, and I'm quoting it, quote, the right and the wrong of what recently happened at the Galwan Valley in the western sector of India-China boundary is very clear. China will continue firmly safeguarding our territorial sovereignty, end quote. A tweet by Brahmchalani, who's a professor of strategic studies at the Center of Policy Research, further points out that missing from China's statement is India's assertion that both sides agree to strictly respect and observe the line of actual control and not take any unilateral action to alter the status quo. Neither does the statement show any urgency of making the process of disengagement quote-unquote expeditiously or quote-unquote at the earliest. So then what do we make of all the differences in these statements? Manoj Joshi, a distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, says that China's statement indicates that there's still some distance to go with disengagement between the countries.
I think these statements make it very clear that we have still some distance to go for a real disengagement, and beyond the disengagement, some kind of a status quo ante. The Chinese claim to the entire Galwan Valley is very new because their 1960 coordinates are well behind the Galwan estuary, which they are now claiming.
If China has been asserting its sovereignty over Galwan Valley, India has been avoiding any insistence on restoring the status quo ante at the LAC while sending covert messages to the Chinese with stern words and app bans, sometimes without even mentioning China. And Mr. Keval Ramani says that while the Chinese statement reiterates its claim over Galwan Valley, which it had maintained throughout the standoff, it also tries to bring the focus back on reorienting the Indo-China ties towards development, a pitch that was derailed in the brewing tensions.
The Chinese side statement talks about reorienting the India-China relationship towards development. And that's obviously a narrative that's been completely derailed over the last month and a half, but also over the past 6 months, ever since the pandemic sort of grew after the initial lockdowns in Wuhan and then subsequently through the world. I think that narrative of development has vanished between India and China, and the Chinese side want to focus on that. They also talk about asking the Indian government to manage the public opinion in the country. And I think this is a recognition of the fact that Indian public opinion, broader public opinion, has grown extremely hostile, not just in the last month and a half, but again, throughout the pandemic. You've seen Indian public opinion being extremely hostile with China. And this is a recognition from Beijing's side that this is an irritant that they want to see addressed in the relationship. The last sort of big thing is that the Chinese side also talks about the fact that India-China relationship are going through quote unquote a complex situation, and these are the kind of things that they would see or they would want in the Indian government to look at. So that differences don't end up becoming disputes. So they're looking at it far more holistically in their statement, apart from the sort of reiteration of the claim towards on the Galwan Valley. They're looking at the border issue as one component. They're looking at the economic issue and the developmental partnership between the two sides as the other issue. This has gotten derailed. They're looking at public opinion in India, which they see as deeply problematic. And they're looking at the broader sort of strategic relationship and saying, look, this judgment that we had that neither of us should take each other to be a fundamental threat has altered. And that's not going to be good for the relationship going forward.
Now, another thing that's been happening on social media is that despite the disengagement at the border, an old newspaper clipping from July 15, 1962, showing the headline, quote-unquote, Chinese troops withdraw from Galwan Post, has been going viral. Why is that? Well, because Galwan Valley has been on the Chinese radar before, and it was also the triggering point for the Sino-Indian War. Barely 3 months after drawing back its troops in the year 1962, On October 20, Galwan Valley was invaded by the advancing PLA, leading to the death of 36 Indian soldiers. And that was the trigger for the war that followed. Many have compared the current situation with 1962 for obvious reasons, and history bears heavy on India and China's territorial clashes. But is there a lesson for India from that event here? Local commanders have already verified the disengagement at the border, but Mr. Keval Ramani says that India still needs to be on its guard until it's satisfied with the disengagement.
It's for some measure that when India and China, sort of the leaders of the two countries meet, they talk about also historical distrust and mistrust that has endured. And I think history bears a very, very heavy sort of, casts a very heavy shadow on the relationship. So I think it's important for the Indian side to be extremely cautious, particularly given how things unfolded in 1962. And it was in July 1962 that you saw the disengagement in Galwan also. And the fact that, this sense of perfidy, Chinese perfidy, and sort of not honoring commitments on the border is so deeply ingrained, this sort of sense of how the Chinese behaved in 1962, that I think it's important for the Indian government to keep in mind that, a repeat of that nature will no longer be acceptable. It's important that we need to learn those lessons from the history and actually make sure that any of this process of disengagement and de-escalation is verified. And at the moment, from what we understand, there is a verification process that is underway, that is being done with satellite imagery, that is being done with surveillance drones at the moment. Subsequently, I'm certain that there will be also physical verification that will take place about the agreed upon terms of de-escalation. And I think that's the process to go. Until then, it's really not feasible for India to sort of let its guard down militarily. We need to be extremely careful. This will be a long process. And 1962, yes, serves as a cautionary tale. There's at no point of time we should be anticipating that things have taken place. We have more tools, more equipment today to observe what's happening on the ground. And I think we are already making use of some of these, and we should continue to make use of these to make sure that the entire de-escalation process is verified. And even after that takes place, it is important to keep in mind that this particular exchange over the last month and a half, how serious in nature it was, how complex it is in terms of understanding where the LAC lies, where perceptions lie on both sides, and what is acceptable behavior. And some of those mechanisms that we've had have sort of withered down. So it's important to keep in mind that even when, if and when we see complete de-escalation and complete disengagement in terms of what's happened currently at the points of friction, it is important to keep in mind that this will be a process that can regenerate. You can end up having again flashpoints. You can end up having again certain incidents which will lead to tensions between the two sides. And given capacity enhancements on both sides, is more or less likely to happen more frequently than less. So it's always important for us to be on the guard in that sense on the border.
If you like listening to this episode, please subscribe to the Big Story playlist for episodic updates. We're live on Apple, Google Podcast, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website and check out the podcast section. For any feedback, shoot an email to podcasts@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.